Chris, thanks for joining me on the SteadFast Running Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Coach, it's an honor for me to be asking the questions here today. You are actually the first coach we've had on the podcast who, at the time of recording, is actively coaching at the college level. And I'd like to begin with your own love affair with running. So, how did you fall in love with running?
Yeah, so I played just about every sport that you could growing up. And to be honest, I was kind of average at most of them. I think a lot of runners are. Um, the one sport that I probably gravitated towards the most, like I played soccer like everyone, I tried football. Hockey was actually one that I was really into, and then they closed the league down that I was in. Running was kind of something that I always really liked the idea of. And I think some of that was because I wasn't as amazing in some of the other sports where, you know, I lived in a rural area. And so it's kind of challenging where like if you don't play on a travel team, if you don't have a bunch of like neighbors or talented friends to play with or, really high level coaching, it can be really hard to get good at those team sports where, it's just you practicing in your backyard with a ball and some cones. Running was that thing that like always clicked in my head as, if I do this, all I have to do is a little bit more of it to get better. So, you know, when fifth grade rolled around, we were doing the gym mile. I ran it really poorly. And I still just remember having this idea of like, all right, if I just run a mile a day, like I'm going to suck at it. But if I do that day after day, it's going to get a little bit easier. Eventually, I'm going to get better at it. And when I stop getting better at it, I can just start doing 2 miles a day. And that was probably like the first coaching thought that I ever had was just this nice idea of like, I understand the idea of getting better with endurance. It's just you do it more, you put time in, you stay healthy, and the whole thing kind of works out. And I eventually joined a track team in sixth grade with a club. It was like a 2 month thing, but improved a lot from it. Met some really cool people. And then that kind of is what continued with, keeping track involved in my life. I kept doing it throughout middle school, played soccer and did track in high school. And then track just became the whole thing year round where began doing cross country and all that from sophomore year onward.
In high school, you were essentially a 4:30 miler. Could you give us a brief overview of the training that you did in high school and the influence that your high school coach had on you?
Yeah. So I'll just to make myself feel better, say I was a little faster than 4:30. But yeah, we didn't have a lot of distance, dominance on our team. We had a lot of good sprinters. We had a lot of good throwers. And I had a coach that cared a lot. But historically, like Sparta would usually produce one good distance athlete every like 7 years or so. And, I was pretty lucky that like for me, I was one of those. Like I ran 4:34 my freshman year, and that was kind of the sign that I was pretty good. For me, like I was just very injury prone. So anytime we would kind of get the ball rolling, something would get derailed. And we eventually started to see that a lot more in college. But high school, we were definitely very like quality over quantity. And I was a big believer in that. My coach was as well. But I think in hindsight, like it works well because I was talented. We had a lot of our teammates that maybe didn't improve quite as much. And I think if we had been a little more patient with just saying, hey, like freshman year, you're running 30 something miles a week. Let's make sure sophomore year, we're trying to get to 40, junior year, trying to get 45 to 50, senior year, trying to be, mid 50s. I think that would probably let me progress a little bit more evenly and maybe gotten me ready for college a little bit more because we definitely hit some times where like my sophomore year, I didn't improve really at all. And I think we tried some things that didn't quite work out. And I think some of it was like my coach had the idea of, hey, let's get our long run to like 12 miles, which is fine. But I didn't have any of the mileage per week to support that. So that run always took a ton out of me. And it just became something where like I was kind of surviving training instead of doing the stuff where it's like, okay, we're just going to lightly progress everything instead of let's really progress one thing hard and like keep the gas on some of the other stuff. But I think it was good kind of getting that experience of, I had a coach with a very particular style, and then college, that was a total 180 where, you know, Andy over at Stony Brook, like he's much more of, you need to run enough miles a week to be successful. You need to do enough long work. And I think there's probably a happy medium between those two that we've landed at now that I think works well. But, high school was definitely probably relied more on my talent and less on like really sound training principles that were going to get me good over a long duration. So
Thank you, Chris. And I'm kind of disappointed in myself for getting your high school PRs
it's not
wrong.
that
I
far.
want to give some due credit to your PR. So what did you graduate with, your personal best at different distances?
So it was 424 in the mile. 800, we started to get it down. I ran like two flat and an open and 157 on relay splits. So if people count that, I don't think we do these days. And then the 2 mile was something that like my freshman year, I was definitely probably better in the 2 mile than anything else. I ran 10:01, but we never really put any emphasis on it later on, which I think is probably a mistake. I think that's something I probably would have gravitated toward more. I think I graduated with like a 9:55 or something like that. So I wasn't like, I wasn't a stellar athlete coming out of high school. I was definitely like my highest level was my freshman year. As far as just like where I was ranked within the country, like that year at nationals, I was 12th in the freshman mile. So it was a little disappointing going through some of those years where, you know, you don't quite live up to the promise that you were hoping you would have. And I think that's also kind of why I wanted to get into coaching was, you know, we had seen that happen before. I had another teammate that kind of had a little bit of a similar fate where, she was phenomenally talented and ran 445 as a freshman girl in a full mile. But I think we both kind of realized that talent is a big part of it, but, there's just certain things you need as a distance runner to be successful. And, a lot of quality doesn't always get you there. So
On that point, Chris, talking about your training in high school being more quality oriented and perhaps on the low side of volume, could you elaborate on what that looked like, maybe a typical week of training?
yeah, so we were typically working out 3 days a week. It was usually Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then a long run on Saturday with Sunday being off. Um, I would say during like the main part of our track season, we would usually have one type of like really fast, almost all out. So it might be 10 or 12 by 100 with a really slow 300-meter jog, and basically just saying average the fastest that you can average on these. Then Wednesday would typically be something at goal race pace for the mile. So a kind of a big staple for us was 20 by 200, and that's still a workout I use now. When I started to get a little bit better, we moved that over to 300s, which I really like, but I think the transition we did with it was a little aggressive. And then our Friday session would typically be some type of like either threshold or 5K type of workout. So it would usually alternate between like a 3 mile tempo and maybe 5 by 1K. And so that tended to be kind of the normal, structure we would have. New Jersey has one really big flaw that some states still carry, but we race so much. That happens in cross country. It happens in track where like you have one or two mid-season or midweek dual meets. You have a invitational, which is usually a relay invite on the weekends. And I think my coach is a little paranoid about us losing meets. And so we would end up racing me usually 3 times in a meet. And I think that was also part of it was in a high school season where just in a full year, you're racing so often. There's not a lot of time to get a lot of training in. And even over the summer, it felt like that because, if you're pretty good, you continue late into June. And then by the time you're starting to do workouts, like you've taken your 2 weeks off, but you feel like you have to start workouts like day one coming back.
Yeah, I can see how it's very easy to get overcooked on a system like that. But things changed for you, I imagine, when you started attending nearby Stony Brook University. So when you reflect on your college running experience, what comes to mind?
College was college was interesting. So when I got there, we definitely saw a really big jump in mileage. And it was probably one I wasn't ready for. And so that summer was a big transition. I got injured pretty quickly. I think even during preseason, I was injured and had my second stress fracture. So it was something where that was a little tough my first year, just kind of, you sort of miss that early opportunity of, getting to know the team really well on runs and like being part of all that. So a little frustrating being on the bike and just kind of surviving with training. We started to figure it out a lot more as the years went on. I usually would have good cross country seasons, but I would always keep getting injured right near the end of cross country. So usually within 2 weeks of regionals, either 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after, sometime in that span, I would almost always walk away with a stress fracture. So that happened almost every year that I was there. Um, and eventually we did this, we had me see a specialist. We did a full like endocrine profile. We found out I had a relatively low thyroid production where like it just basically made it where recovering was a lot more challenging. And we kind of found that there was this tipping point where if I was under 50 to 55 miles a week, I was usually okay. Once I got above that, I was just kind of on borrowed time, which it's a shame because I usually responded really well to running more. It's just eventually something would break and it was usually my femur. So when a bone that big ends up breaking from running, there's typically something bigger going on.
I see. So it was a combination of maybe too much too soon and that thyroid issue that you were dealing with.
Yeah, that's what we thought. And near the end, when they figured that out, they said, we can put you on a thyroid medication. Um, the downside is if you go on it, you're probably going to have to be on it for the rest of your life. And we don't know if, that one season of running that you have left in eligibility is worth being on medication for the rest of your life. So I opted not to do that. And, I still run now, just at a level that hopefully doesn't get me injured.
Apart from the inconsistency that you must have had in training because of all these injury struggles, and when you look back, are there any positives, any highlights? I mean, I know you ran 32:15 in the 10K one year at the cross country regional meets, but how do you see things now looking back?
I'm happy with the experience. I mean, obviously, like we always want to be better. We always want to have perfectly injury-free seasons. Um, but I'm really happy I got exposed to a coaching style that was very different than what I was seeing in high school. Um, it was really cool that we were part of the first men's team that ever won a conference title. And so I think that was like, if there was a single memory within track and field that like I still hold on to, it was that day. I mean, Stony Brook men have been very good for a very long time. And like, if you look at their team right now, they've well eclipsed anything that my athletes, my teammates did when we were there. So it's cool to see what they've done since then. And I think we were always kind of buying into the idea of like, we can be the first team that does this and we can now sort of set the stage for this being a regular thing at Stony Brook. So for us, it was really cool. And it was nice that was one of the seasons I was healthy for. But yeah, I think that was one of the biggest things. And like I said, I think being exposed to training that was very different. Like I was all in on the idea behind it and really wanted to embrace something that was different because I had seen enough throughout high school to know that what we were doing worked really well for a handful of athletes, but for a lot of us, it really wasn't clicking that well. I was one of the lucky ones that I did improve pretty quickly from it. When I stayed healthy, I had good seasons, but it was nice being part of a training system that, even though I didn't survive it that great, like it was much more consistent for our athletes. It was something that I think let me grow as a coach and made it so that I wasn't just stuck in thinking like, oh, my high school coach knows everything, so I'm just going to reproduce that. And it kind of became I know that there's good parts of both systems. I don't think either of them is perfect, but now I can, when I, as a coach, I'm going to start making training plans, I can kind of borrow from both of them. I can kind of ignore both of them when I think it's necessary and come up with something that I feel like, it has little pieces of each of them, but I think it looks like a very different thing than either of those places.
And it's cool to hear that you're still running, and it intrigues me. It has always intrigued me, this relationship that coaches have to their own running, whether they happen to be past their prime or not. And in your case, you're still very young. So did you leave the track behind? Did you move to the roads? How has your relationship to running evolved over the last 6 years or so?
So I had to take a lot of time off after Stony Brook. I had one injury near the end that like I basically tore the attachment site for like four different muscles in my pelvis, and that one took a while just to like not feel any pain walking around. So for me, like I like running now because I feel like it's just a healthy thing for me to do. I feel like it keeps me in touch with the sport. I still like doing workouts and somehow roped one of our assistant soccer coaches into doing some of them with me. So like I like that atmosphere. I like being able to say that I'm still fighting the good fight in its own way, but I don't really race anymore. If I do, it's kind of a one-off thing. Like I think my last race was 2 years ago. It was like a 10-mile brewery run with like Sable Running Company, a store I used to work at in college. And it was just like a way of saying like, all right, like I know I'm not fast anymore, but let's see what happens. Let's, pretend to train hard for it for 2 months, and what happens happens. But I also like that I'm at least right now in shape enough that I can kind of be my own guinea pig. So over the summer, like I'll try out different workouts just so I kind of know how they feel. I know my athletes are going to register that a little differently than I will because, they're actually really good athletes. But it's still nice to kind of have that like intuitive touch of like, okay, I've lived this. I haven't forgotten what it's like. Sometimes I think there's some coaches that have not been around it recently enough to remind themselves like some of the workouts that they're writing are really, really hard and that there's a reason their athletes can't do it. And there's also some that are on the opposite end of the spectrum where like we had a ton of athletes this year that just we kept making workouts harder because they were that good. And it was probably a little out of what my comfort zone was from years before, but it's, it's the level of workout that they needed to get better.
And I'm going to pull on this string just a little bit more because your career just seems to be characterized by injury. And having dealt with injuries myself and going through one right now, it's sort of top of mind. Do you feel like you were able to leave running, or at least competitive running, on your own terms? I mean, how have you come to peace with all of that? Has it been a struggle at all for you?
It was probably more of a struggle when it was happening. I think I was someone that always knew I liked coaching more than running. And like I loved running. So I'm okay with saying that and knowing that it just means that coaching for me was like the ultimate dream of mine. Like I knew I wanted to do this back when I was in high school. I really knew I wanted to do it in college. And that's like how I steered most of my education, was trying to make sure that I could get to where I am now. So I think for me, it was nice knowing that even if running, I didn't live up to the potential that I thought I had. I kind of knew that like my fantasy was I wanted to coach Olympians. I wanted to be able to say that, I had a team that could win conference titles. And, that to me was always more interesting than, I like the puzzle of it. And if running didn't work out for me, like I can point to some injuries and I can say that, maybe if coaching was different, maybe if I had access to soft trails year round, or if my school had an ultra G or something, like maybe that would have made the difference. Or maybe if it was just a more gradual progression. But I think for me, like when I finished with the sport, I was happy with the things I did. I was happy with how it set me up as like, kind of formulating the way that I think about running as a whole, that I was okay walking away from it the way it was. If I was able to do it over again, I'm sure I would change things. But, I think most of that's just when someone runs a 4:34 as a freshman in high school, like, you kind of live in that limelight for a little bit thinking, oh, like if I can just drop down to 4:20 next year, I can probably be a guy that thinks about going under 4:10 by senior year. And then, then you're a guy that's thinking about going sub 4 in college. But, that's still a long stretch between where I actually ran. Because I think even in college, like my 1500 only converted to like a 421 mile or something like that. So, 8K was probably my best race, and maybe that 10K at Van Cortlandt, but never got to experience a track season that didn't follow a femoral stress fracture. So,
Well, let's talk about this big passion of yours, coaching, which has helped fill the void left behind by competitive running in your case. So in 2016, you got your first big coaching gig at Northwestern State University, but it wasn't your first go at coaching. You were a volunteer assistant for a while at Stony Brook, and going further back, you worked with kids at Sparta High School, and you were a biology major in college with a concentration in physiology. So in a certain sense, your career has followed the traditional path, I would say, of paying your dues and working your way up the ranks. When did the idea of coaching start to crystallize in your head?
I knew I wanted to coach when I was in high school, but I didn't think I wanted to do it at the college level. There was always this like part of it was just I was never in college at that point, so I didn't know what it was really like. But I remember like we had a rival high school at in Sparta. It was Pope John, and they were a phenomenal track team. But like we would always see kids that were from like different towns that attended there, and like they all did it legitimately. So there was nothing, there was no like illegal recruiting going on. But I think we always, as the one public school in town, were like, oh, like we have to do it just from the kids in our township. Like they're getting, athletes from Morristown or Roxbury or wherever. And like recruiting was always that thing to me that I didn't like the idea of it, because it felt to me like whoever wins recruiting is going to win as a team. Because if you can just get out of high school a bunch of guys that run 4.0 something in the mile, like you're going to have a good team. You could make all of those guys slower over 4 years and you'll still have a really good team. So I think in high school, I wanted to go into like, I was studying engineering at first, and I thought like, oh, if I do this successfully, I would love to eventually go back and like coach high school. And then I kind of realized like, I don't want to ever step away from the sport. So switched over to biology so that I could like teach and then coach high school, and then realize like college is this really cool way for me to make this my entire life. I don't have to teach. I don't have to, worry about all that stuff. I can just be a coach. And so when I made that switch, I wanted to go as all in on it as I could. That's kind of why I chose biology. Was I figured worst case scenario, I can either go into teaching and still coach high school, or I could even do like, I could work in a sports science lab or do some like exercise physiology research as like a postgraduate, and at least like stay kind of around, this world for a little bit, and maybe do like volunteer coaching. So it was all just kind of like I really didn't want to work in biology, but I figured it was a good way to get into like kinesiology or exercise physiology or something like that. And it was just kind of all a ploy to buy enough time so that I could give college coaching a real chance to work out.
Yeah, and it was good decision making on your part. I think it's a great model for other coaches out there who are listening, who are just starting their careers. Now let's get a little philosophical here. What do you think is a coach's first job, or the most important job that any of us coaches have?
It probably depends on the level you're at. I think if you're in high school, there's kind of two things to me. One is that like in high school, you're going to be genuinely shaping people in some of their most formative years. And as a high school coach, you can connect with your athletes in a different way than most teachers can. And so I think that has to be a big part of it, where, there's some teams that take running really seriously and they do it in the right way. And there's probably some that do it in a way that's a little destructive, where it kind of sets kids up for a really rough few years later, because running's their only identity and that's where they feel their only worth. And I think that can get really tricky. When it's in college, we still have that. Like, we'll still have athletes come up to us or, give us a call several years after they graduate and like, they'll thank you for doing something that you didn't realize you did. And just, maybe you were there to listen to them. Maybe you were someone that helped them through a time that you didn't realize they were even going through something that rough. But I think in college, that's kind of the first time that we can be a little bit more leaning toward the performance side and say that, at the end of the day, like if we're not accomplishing the goals of our university, whether that's, recruiting, whether that's winning, whether that's, giving athletes a great experience as a whole, like that's when it gets tough. But I think the biggest one to us is always just, we're trying to realize that these are people. And I think having my own experience as a runner, running's not fun if you're not doing well. And it's particularly dejecting if you're putting everything into it and it still just isn't working out season after season, year after year. So I think part of it has to be like, we owe it to them to do the best job that we can to create, the best athletes. And sometimes that means just making sure that they run a lot of PRs, but some of that also means that, some of them don't have great coping mechanisms built from high school. We need to be the ones that help teach them that so that they can survive college and that they can actually, be functioning human beings in the real world afterward.
That's well said, Coach. And I agree that the performance side of things is extremely important. And I'm sure you take a holistic approach to coaching as well. I like to say we coach people, right? We don't just coach muscle cells. And so, after working with people and all the complexities that involves individually and within a team setting, which I think is an even greater challenge, what have you learned about people and what are some of the techniques that you've used to get into that headspace, get rid of the things that are holding them back and helping them thrive in all areas of their life?
I think the biggest thing is that, like, if there's one thing I think we've done really well here is we've gotten people to buy into the idea of kind of what we're doing. And that goes a really long way. Like, if you don't trust in what you're doing, you're probably not going to get better. And, that comes from writing good workouts. That comes from obviously them seeing results. But I think one of the biggest things is that when I was first involved in coaching, like I micromanaged everything. I was like very intent on like, I thought if I balanced all the variables perfectly, I could create like the perfect training plan. And it doesn't work like that. And so nowadays, like I get a ton of feedback from my athletes and sometimes we listen to it, sometimes we don't. But I think that goes a very long way in getting them to believe in what they're doing, because like if I'm recruiting a kid, it's probably because they were pretty good wherever they came from, whether they were a transfer athlete or whether they were a high school kid. And so I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel with that person every single time they come in. I would rather talk to them, figure out what's worked, what hasn't worked, what clicks for them, what just has never seemed to figure out, how it works. And just, if there's a way for us to say, all right, we know that these workouts have worked really well for you, let's incorporate more of them. Let's get it to where they can walk away from most training sessions thinking like, oh, this is the stuff that I know works for me. I'm going to be better. And I think most of the time, if you're doing that day in and day out at practice, you're going to run well. And Steve Magnus had a really good little like line. It was, you want to win more workouts than you lose. And like that should be, you should win almost every workout that you go up to. And that doesn't necessarily mean like that every workout is better than every other workout that ever came before it. But like if I'm giving my kids a tempo run and saying, all right, I think this kid can run 5:20 pace for 4 miles, I'm probably going to tell them to start out at 5:30s. And then maybe the last mile, we might do 5:20. What's most likely going to happen is that kid's going to start out probably faster than I want him to anyways, but hopefully a little bit more tame than 5:20. and he's probably going to drop down to 520. And honestly, he's probably going to go a little faster. And at very least, that kid's going to walk away thinking like, oh, I beat the workout. I did what I was supposed to do. And as long as I'm there to kind of keep them from making that workout turn into a race, you know, they're still going to be in a safe place for training. They're still going to get out of it what I wanted them to get out of it. But now they're kind of reframing it as, instead of like, oh, Chris told me to run 520 pace, but I was running 522, 523. Like, some kids look at that as being a complete failure. And now when they line up in a race, they're like, oh, I haven't hit a workout well this whole year. But if you do it the other way and they're like, oh, Chris thinks I should have been running 530 pace and I've been running 522, 523, like, I'm in better shape than he thought I was going to be in. So, you know, I don't try to be all like very gimmicky with how we do things. Like, sometimes before a race, we might, you know, meet up the day before, jog the course, and then like have everyone close their eyes and just walk them through verbally, like, all right, first 400 meters, how are you getting out? Who's around you? How many people do you see in front of you? How many people are behind you? When you get to this point, where are you hoping to be for the first mile? Or when you hit this hill? And like, I think that stuff can be helpful, but I think, you know, 80% of the work gets done well before you get anywhere near the course.
Yeah, and I love how you're defining for your athletes, what does winning look like in a workout, or as you visualize that before a race, visualizing performance before a race. And coaches, as we know, are held to a high standard. And you, Chris, are expected to a certain extent to produce results at the program that you are working at right now. But I think it's kind of a two-way street, right? I think I've been in situations, and I'm sure you have as well, where you're working with an athlete, you're doing everything that you can to make them better, but it just doesn't work out. And so I'm curious, when you're trying to decide which athletes will be the best fit for your program, for your coaching style, what expectations are you communicating to them?
So I think most coaches we're all a little bit arrogant and we think we can all get every athlete to be better. So I'm not too picky about like what kind of athletes we bring in as far as their athletic background. Like, if they've run fast enough, we'll probably trust ourselves to get them better. But I think we've always tried to make sure that we're bringing in people that, you know, kind of fit that nebulous term of culture the way that we want. And the thing we've always sold here, it's never been like, oh, this is the team we have, like, we would love to have you be part of it. We've always tried to sell the team that we want to be. And part of that was we had to. Like, when I first took the job here, we had one male on the team and we had 6 women on the team. So like, we didn't have enough athletes to even say we had a full team on the men's side. And I think our fastest woman on the team wasn't even under 520 for the mile. So like, it's hard to sell that at the collegiate level and talk to really fast athletes and be like, oh, we improved our 520 girl to 510. Like, imagine what we can do with you. We do a little bit of that, but I think we were more so selling the idea of like, if you come here, we think we can develop you. We think that you can be the start of what builds a really great program here. Like, I know you're going to get a lot of individual coaching attention from me because our team is pretty small, and like, you know, you being a top athlete, like, obviously you're going to get a lot of attention anyways. But I think we were also trying to leverage a little bit of like, if we can get one fast person signed, now we can talk to a few other fast people and say like, you know, we got this person, now you have someone to train with. And like, that's sort of how we got the snowball effect of being able to talk to some recruits that were just genuinely way out of our league. But now they started to see that like, this wild pipe dream that I was trying to sell them before now is a little less wild than it was. And so, you know, that's kind of been our whole thing, was we knew we were really far back. We knew like our first year, we were the last place team in our conference. So realistically, we can't talk to those girls that are going to win a conference championship and say like, oh, we're the best fit for you. We kind of had to tell them, hey, if you're here, I guarantee you, like, you're going to see stuff change. You're going to see this team get better. And 5 to 10 years from now, you're going to be able to look back on it and say, like, I built that team. And so that's kind of what we really looked for, was we wanted some people that weren't afraid to take a chance and weren't afraid to like step into a leadership role pretty quickly, because that's just what we needed. We were too small and we were too far back to like just organically say like, oh, we're going to take our current team and we're just going to somehow get them to be a top team in the conference. So it happened with a lot of recruiting, and like we're lucky that we've developed some athletes pretty well. And now that those athletes that were originally on the team, like now they're ready to score. Now they're old enough that they can handle that. But it came with also getting a lot of people on board with the idea of like, we can be really good. You just might have to be the first piece of the puzzle for it.
You are building something special at LIU. How far has the program come along, in addition to growing in size, which you mentioned? What are some of the benchmarks that you have hit, and what are you looking forward to entering the 2022 cross country season?
Yeah, so I'll start with the women's side, since theirs was probably the bigger contrast of the two. We were 10th out of 10 my first year here, which is not great. Considering that like a couple of the teams we should have probably been ahead, but you know, it is what it is. We had a bad day, and we had a team that, the year before we were Division 2. So like it was a whole new ballpark for everyone involved. That second year was COVID, and that probably got lucky for us because it meant that we had more time to develop athletes and we could kind of like set up recruiting the way that we wanted to. We never felt like with a looming track season, we have to produce, otherwise we're going to have recruits that aren't interested in us. So I think it was kind of lucky that we got a couple of fast people in. We developed some other athletes that ended up getting pretty good. We placed fifth that year during like the winter conference championship for cross country. And then this past fall, we finished second. So the women went from 10th to second in basically 2 years. And throughout that time, like I think our women have broken 14 school records, which is pretty cool. And definitely if you look at like track times, like we didn't have anyone running under 5:20 when I first got here for a full mile. We now have probably 3 girls that are sub 5 or like right at 5 flat, with another couple that are like 5:03. Same thing with like 5K. Like, we have a few girls one that's been under 17, a few that are mid to low 17s. We had our first girl go to regionals, which was, really fun with Kelly running fast in steeplechase. And then the men's side was kind of the same thing, where like we've definitely leaned a little bit more middle distance with them. Just we've found some really good recruits that made us kind of say, let's be more of an 800, 1500 team than necessarily a longer distance. But, on the men's side, I don't think we put any distance athletes on the podium for any track event. This year, indoor, we won the 800, the 3K, the 5K, and then placed second in the mile. So like, it's been cool seeing that. We've had definitely a few really good recruits that panned out, and like a few of them have dropped a ton of times since they've gotten here. So it's been really nice being able to see that, some really impressive changes happened. And like a lot of that's just, we have athletes that work really hard and, bought into the insane idea that we can actually be really good here, when we haven't really had any history of success since like the last really successful coach here was probably Vin Lanana back in like the 70s. So it's been a while.
Oh, that's interesting trivia. I didn't know that Vin had coached at LIU.
Yeah, I want to say he went here, and then it was either Dartmouth or Stanford, and then Oregon, and then USATF, and now back at UVA.
And speaking about your athletes, because I'm sure there are many examples of athletes that you've coached, let's just say over the last 3 years, who have had major breakthroughs. And of course, success doesn't happen overnight, nor is it the work of just one person. But I always go back to the impact that we have as coaches, the power of connection, the power of a coach that knows you as a runner and as a person and that believes in you. Can you speak to what those relationships mean to you?
I think they're basically everything that gets your athletes better. Because I mean, I've had times where like, especially my earlier years before LIU, like we had athletes that definitely were like, well, why should we trust you? Like when I started at Northwestern State, I was 23. When you have grad students that are 21 or 22, like it's hard for them to buy into the idea that someone a year or two older than them should be coaching them, let alone that he'll actually know what he's doing. And I definitely made a million mistakes back then. So some of that's probably warranted. But I think with us here, I think our athletes know that I'm going to listen to them. And I might tell them that I think they're wrong and that we're not going to do what they want to do. But I think all of them know that if something ever goes wrong, like they can talk to me. And that was probably one of the things with my high school coach that I appreciated the most was when things weren't going great, I never felt like, I never felt like I was disappointing him or that I couldn't talk to him or that, we were just going to be stuck there. It was very much a collaborative, like, this is what I'm feeling. At the end of the day, like, there's definitely some athletes that I feel like I know their body probably better than they do, but that's not for everybody. There's going to be times where like something pops up or there's an injury or they're just like, hey, I'm feeling out of it. And that could be for any number of reasons, but like we're not all knowing. We have to be able to trust them enough for them to say, okay, if this is what I'm feeling, this is maybe how we should tweak things so that, they can trust us, so that they can buy into what we're doing, because it's not just me saying, oh, like, look at our results, I'm always right, like we're gonna be fine, just keep it going. Like, there's a coach I worked with at Northwestern State. He's probably one of the best sprint coaches in the country. His name is Adam Pennington. And Adam's very much like, he'll say quite a bit in practice, like, trust the process. And I'm always someone that like, I'm hesitant to say that wording because like for him, he's phenomenally good. Like he's produced so many great athletes that like they'd be idiots not to trust the process there. For me, like I just know that the way I'm kind of wired and the way that most distance runners are, we're very analytical. And I don't ever want someone to just hear me go, well, just trust me, like it'll be fine. I would rather explain to them, like, this is why we're doing this workout. This is why I think you're feeling the way you're feeling. If you are feeling this, this is maybe how we should tweak it. And then also just get their feedback to know that, like, if they have a handful of workouts that, like one of our girls has a particular pre-meet workout that she likes. I don't think it's a good workout, but I also don't think it's harmful. And so if it makes her feel confident, 4 days out before a race, and I don't think it's going to end up being negatively impactful, I don't care. That's fine. Like it makes her feel good, makes her feel ready. That's what we're going to do to, give her that last little bit of confidence, because I know that the other 12 months of training that we've done have been really good. So it works out fine in the end.
I love that. I think that's going to be the one soundbite of the episode that we're going to end up highlighting. Just a remarkable story and the way you connected that to your own style. So I appreciate you sharing that. So then we've been talking about coaching in general, and I think most coaches, regardless of what level they coach at, they're familiar with the programming side of it, writing workouts and explaining to your athletes the purpose behind those workouts. And I think even the layperson listening to this might understand the recruiting aspect, which you have to go through as a college coach. But could you talk about all the other challenges that you have as a college coach that maybe someone who coaches at the pro level, the club level, or the private level might not know about? And why do you think college coaching is a good fit for you?
So I like college coaching because it gets to be the thing that I can focus on. With high school coaching has this like really nice purity to it where it's the athletes that show up, maybe some places do a little bit of recruiting with like kind of doing like what York High School would do, giving their seniors a clipboard and saying, bring me every freshman you can find. But like, there's kind of a nice, just like, okay, we're going to do the best with what we've got. College, you're right. Like, there's a lot of recruiting. I think that's probably the part that people don't realize as much is like, you live and die by how your recruiting goes. Because at the end of the day, the reason why some of my best athletes are our best athletes, it's not necessarily because we got them and they were already as good as they are right now. It's that we got them because they were already really high responders. And so they ended up rising to the top throughout high school. We saw that, we brought them here, and they continued rising to the top. So that stuff's always really straightforward. I think when you get outside of just the X's and the O's of like attending practice, making training plans, and recruiting, college has a lot of like, it's a lot of paperwork. And it's my least favorite part of the job, but it's also something that can be really time consuming. I don't have any assistants here, so there's no way for me to like pass off doing recruiting logs to somebody, or, Carol logs, which are basically logging how many hours a week you practice. There's no person I can give, my login information to and say, all right, register us for this meet. I want you to like set up our hotels, travel, getting meals, getting ready for preseason or equipment orders. But I think the other stuff is like, I'm someone that there's a lot of things I want to do to make our team better. And those things, since they haven't been done before, they take a lot of time out of your day. And sometimes they lead to absolutely nowhere. So I think that's always what frustrates me a little bit is like, for coaches that are at a really high level, there's a lot of things that we're trying to do that never materialize, that are probably good ideas at some point, but you sort of have to sink in a certain amount of time into them to know if it's going to work out or not. So like, I'm hoping that we host a meet coming up pretty soon that I want to see if we can try and make it a little bit more interesting than what some meets have been in the past. And I don't know if it'll happen this year, if we have to sort of build up to it in years to come, but like, I want to see if we can try and bring more spectators into track and field or into cross country. So if that means having like a farmer's market right next to our cross country course when it's going on, great. If it means bringing in like, a live band to play so that people come out to see it, and there just happens to be a cross country course running around it, awesome, brings more people. If it's something where I can get like the journalism department or our communications department involved so they can do, post-race interviews with the team that wins or the individuals, or, doing like race videos or whatever it happens to be, like those are the things that eventually lead to, do you have a big enough event that more people want to go to it? Can you get sponsors for it? And like, that stuff takes a long time, and there's a chance it might never work out. I hope it does, but it's still, those things where you never know. And like this past year, we put a little bit of work into trying to partner with Garmin to basically get our team GPS watches. That was one that fortunately worked out to where now all of our kids have a GPS watch if they didn't have one before. And now we can sync it with like some of the training apps we use so that, I can, as again, the only coach here, I can monitor what workouts they've done in the past. I can check their splits from a few weeks back. I can like, see if they've given any notes on how workouts went. And so, a lot of the time those extra things, like they take away from the other stuff you were trying to do, or, recruiting or planning, but sometimes they work out and they're actually something that really benefits the team.
Yeah, time consuming, but hopefully worth it in the end. So what advice would you have for coaches at large, so not just college coaches, regarding education, regarding career path, and how they can enhance their intellectual and experiential preparedness?
So the path that I took, which is not necessarily the best one, but I kind of tried to check off as many boxes as I could as early as I could. So like all throughout high school and college, I read every book that you could find. I listened to the handful of podcasts that existed back then, or finding videos on YouTube, or reading Runner's World or Running Times back when it existed, or even combing through like Let's Run message boards, seeing if there's just like one or two gems in that entire place that might have something that's helpful. And I think that stuff goes a long way. Doing things like the USATF or USTFCCCA education courses, I think they can be a good step, but I think they're a better step for getting to know other coaches than it is on their own. Like my background being biology, I kind of knew most of the stuff that they were going through as far as like the first 2 days or so are typically like physiology related. Then it starts getting into the X's and the O's. And even a lot of that is kind of review work for people that have been in the sport for a while. I think the best thing that you can do is like find a coach that's been successful and just send them an email. It's the easiest way to be able to get something to happen. Like some coaches are really unapproachable, but most aren't. Most are pretty good with it where, I've reached out to people that I've heard on a podcast and just said like, hey, I thought this was a really cool idea. Like, do you mind if I give you a call just to ask a few questions? Or like there was a really successful high school coach. He was at Morris Hills High School in Jersey back when I was an athlete. And when I came back one summer from grad school and like my first year of coaching, found a way to get in touch with him through, the staff directory, sent him an email and just said, hey, like your team would always beat ours. And I thought it was always really cool how you guys developed 800 runners. Can we talk over the phone? He was like, yeah, if you're in the area, like we can get breakfast or something. And so I think that's probably the best way, because anytime that you look at those other resources, sometimes it's that they're set up in a way that it's more theory than practice, and it's hard to translate the way that you want. The other is that we as coaches, we kind of have this really bad bias where like, if I give you one of our training plans, most people will look through it thinking, what workout can I take? What can I use to be able to, make my team better? And that doesn't work very well. I would love for conversations about training to move away from like what's a good workout to what's a good progression. Because like a 3-mile tempo is a great workout. It's not fancy, it's not a sexy workout, but it's a good workout. The more important thing is, how do you improve on that 3-mile tempo? Is it by making it faster? Is it by saying, okay, we're going to go from a 3-mile tempo to 4 by 1600 so that we can then take a step to a 2-mile, 1 mile, 1 mile, and then eventually 2 by 2 miles. And now eventually we're running a 4 straight mile tempo. And now you can say, all right, my 4-mile tempo at that same pace was better than my 3-mile tempo. Like that's the stuff I think people need to look into, is more of like, look less at like, oh, this team does the Michigan workout, and more at like what led up to it so that the Michigan workout can even make sense. Because if you build a list of workouts from everyone's greatest hits, you're not going to have a good program. You need to just have a nice steady progression that just every once in a while throws in one of those special workouts to say, hey, like this is one that we do because we think it's useful, but like no one's doing the Michigan 4 times in the season. Or if they are, like more power to them, but we can't do that.
I love it, Chris. I'm nodding my head because I agree 100%. Workouts don't tell the whole story. You need context, and we should be talking about progressions. And actually, for the final segment of the show, I'd like to now start talking about the science of running so we can get into the nitty-gritty of training. And we're fortunate to have someone like you here who has spent a great deal of time, speaking of mentors and reaching out to other coaches. And you're someone who has been able to form this cohesive framework around which to structure training, and you've been putting those ideas into practice with success. So from a physiological perspective, and without getting into the specifics just yet, what would you say are some of the major underpinnings of your training model?
So I think the biggest thing is that we're typically trying to progress almost everything as we go. I don't, I'm not all that big on like big periodization blocks that are like, okay, we're only going to work on this, we're only going to work on that. And like, I think that just becomes really hard where, you know, how do you know that you've gotten better by doing, let's say, 6 weeks of lactate threshold training and then 6 weeks of VO2 max and then 6 weeks of, you know, some like specific race pace block or something, you know, comparing those weeks and those blocks to each other, it can be very hard to be able to say like, I know that a 4 mile tempo run at 520 pace is equivalent to, you know, 7 800s with a 1-to-1 rest at, you know, 228 pace. Like it might be, it might not be. I think for us, the biggest thing is that we're always trying to make sure that everything is taking some type of step forward or trying to maintain something. So, you know, early in the summer, we're going to do what most people do. We're going to probably take some time off. We're going to build up to some amount of mileage. Usually it's something that they've handled before. And then we're going to try and push that needle a little bit further forward. So that way we know that, you know, as a sophomore in college, you're probably running a little more than you did as a freshman. As a junior, you're probably running a little more than you did as a sophomore. We want to know that everything that we're doing is getting a little bit better. We also do a good amount of speed development year round, and we do a lot of lactate threshold. So I would say like those are probably the biggest things that are like constant throughout our training plan year round, and just making sure that like if we think that it's important and if we know that it takes a long time to develop, it has to be really early in our training plan. Like when I see teams that are afraid of doing like fast all out sprinting and they think like, okay, that's, I need to save that till the end of the year. Like you don't build top speed in 6 weeks. It just doesn't happen. So I think for us, like we want to make sure that there's no weak chain anywhere in there, so that like if we have an athlete and we know that they're running, let's say it's a female running 5 flat in the mile. If her 800 is only a 222 or a 224, like she is running so close to what her 800 PR is during her mile that she's not going to get better. So we want to make sure that we're still building on speed development so that that ceiling's high. We want to know that we're still working on building up mileage gradually, because big jumps always seem to cause problems for us. But that also is, again, like if you run enough miles a week, you're going to have a pretty high ceiling. And like lactate threshold to me is that way of making endurance functional. So that's probably the one that like we dedicate the most amount of time to over anything else. Is we do a lot of tempo work, even on workouts that aren't really focused much on it. We'll typically lead off with something that has a little bit of lactate threshold in it, or there might be like a middle rep that just kind of, after we've built up some fatigue, we know we have to run a little more controlled and handle it. But that seems to be like the biggest way to keep athletes fit year round and make sure that like you've kind of evened them off a little bit more, where, you know, I think we're always within about 8 weeks of being in really good shape. So if we were told middle of cross country season, hey, like the plan changed, we now need to be good milers, like I think we could become pretty good milers. It won't be as good as it is at the end of an outdoor season, but like I would say we're always within a month to 2 months of like we can set PRs in whatever event we want, just by like dialing it in and making it a little more specific.
Has your philosophy evolved over time? And what are some of the big overarching questions that you are still coming back to and still wrestling with?
I think the biggest one is, how can we find out how to train a specific individual better earlier? Because that's like, we've had athletes that just, they get here on day one and they start doing amazing right away. And we don't have to tweak a whole lot. We just say, all right, the program's working. Let's just keep it rolling, make it a little bit more intense the next year, make the volume a little bit higher, like, you know, just kind of keep the train on the tracks. But there's also times where we'll get an athlete that it seems like they would click really well with what we do, and for some reason they just don't. And like one of our girls, I know, she was a good example of it. where her freshman and sophomore year, like she would have these like individual seasons that would go really well, and we'd feel like, oh, like we finally figured it out, we're ready, like this is gonna be great. And then a couple weeks later, things would just kind of unravel where like she wasn't getting injured, but she just wasn't improving. And so going into her junior year, like we changed everything. We like moved from doing 2 workouts a week back to doing 3 workouts a week, like I did in high school, and just said, hey, like you seem to respond well to quality, so let's do more of that. Let's kind of tone down the mileage and just make sure it's high enough. But then she had like training as a miler, even during the summer and fall, she ran her best 5K times. So like that shouldn't happen, at least not in the way we would expect, but it would be really nice to start learning better ways to like dial that in sooner. And I think we're getting better at it, but I mean, it would be amazing if we could bring that down to where it's like, oh, we can kind of profile an athlete well enough within the first couple of weeks instead of the first couple of seasons, just so like the moment that they get there, they're ready to go. Or at least like we're maintaining things well enough to say, all right, we know some things that are working, we're seeing some things that aren't. Let's kind of tweak those a little bit, and then we should start to see some traction. Then we can lean into the stuff that is working really well and just see it continue to accelerate.
Yeah, and that underpins the observation that most of us coaches have, that we're just involved here in a trial and error process with most of our athletes, or all of our athletes actually. And sometimes our athletes don't respond to the training in the way that we want them to or expect them to. And then we have to individualize things and get creative. And like you said, it may be going with more quality or less quantity, or maybe it's figuring out what the proper balance is between the stress and the recovery components. Sometimes it's something going on in their personal life.
Yeah, you're right. It could be like if they're going through a bad breakup at a time where they're also hitting finals week, like we might not be able to fight against that. We might just have to say, let's keep things going as best we can and just kind of survive it.
Yeah. So maybe now we can get more specific in terms of explaining a few of the training interventions that you might layer into someone's body of work over the course of let's just go with a cross-country season, for example. So maybe you can go through a series of workouts. And again, I don't want to focus just on workouts, because like you said, it's more about the big picture and what's the purpose behind this workout and how does it fit into the overall scheme. So let's say you've got a junior or a senior, you want them to peak for the conference meet. What are some of the basic progressions going to look like there?
Yeah, so I would say most of our workouts throughout our cross-country season, if you were to kind of draw the line from when we start doing workouts, which honestly we've already begun, so like we start probably earlier than a lot of teams do. We're going from very general training to much more specific. Most of the time, like that's how coaching is in general. We just know that that's how human body tends to respond pretty well. But we tend to get into lactate threshold pretty early. I would say like the early stuff throughout the summer is a little less structured, just because I don't want them going to a track every couple days. So it might be like steady state runs, progression runs, things that just like, they kind of transfer some of the more aerobic mileage that we've done into something that's a little bit more functional and just gets them into like, okay, it's still really aerobic. You know, you can't do a 10-mile steady state run at, just under 6-minute pace and like not have it be aerobic. Even if you're pushing hard the whole way, it's still, a very, very long session. But ultimately we want to move that stuff down towards into like lactate threshold. And honestly, we spend most of our time throughout the season at that. So like our first handful of workouts in preseason, they're probably all going to be some type of tempo run or some type of broken tempo. So when I see teams that are doing like an 8x1K for their men or maybe 6x1K for their women, a lot of the time they're starting out the season just trying to target race pace right away. And that's fine to do. I don't think that's wrong necessarily. But the cross country season is long. Most of the time, we're going to probably lean towards saying, hey, instead of doing 8 by 1K at race pace, let's do 10 by 1K, but let's do it at a tempo pace. And then when they get through the first half of it, then we might give them permission to say, hey, like these last 3 to 5, we'll let you go a little bit faster. So they're just like very early in the season touching on race pace, but we're not diving very deep into it. As the season goes, those workouts start transitioning into being more and more about race pace, like they're seeing it more often. But we're also factoring in that like every weekend that we go out to race, they're going to see a big dose of race pace. So it's not that big of a deal if we don't touch on it that often, because we can do a lot of it from the second half of September into like most of October. We also probably do a little bit more work with like some, if you like read like Running with the Buffaloes, Wetmore would call it like neuromuscular running. We probably wouldn't, but doing something like, 200s at mile pace, it doesn't seem like it would fit that great in a cross country season, but I think we kind of need that contrast to feel like well-rounded athletes. So we pepper that in kind of as its own individual stimulus to make sure that we always see it every like 2 to 3 weeks. Yeah, most of the time it's just steadily progressing from a lot of lactate threshold to, a lot of lactate threshold with a little bit of race pace, then with a moderate amount of race pace, and then finally getting into like middle of October where it's like, okay, most of our workouts are done at 8K pace or 5K pace, or like getting into those things that are going to make us a little bit sharper. But cross country is probably the season we do the least amount of peaking for, just because like the race is so specific. You really can't get around the fact that like for your men in particular, they have to be able to handle 8 to 10,000 meters of hard running. We don't need a lot of time spent doing 300s to like build buffering capacity. Like that stuff's fine, and we definitely do it, but it's a very small piece of the puzzle. Like we're trying to move the big rocks that end up giving us the most fitness and sort of just letting the pebbles fall into place as they go.
Yeah, that specificity aspect. Do you have a workout or a set of workouts? I don't think there are any true predictor workouts, but as a coach, you're getting close to that goal race. You want to get an idea of what your athlete might be capable of running in that race, pace wise. Do you have any good indicator workouts that are specific to the 10K or the 8K?
Honestly, no. We don't do a lot of stuff where we're trying to figure that out. Most of the time, we have pretty good racers. I think most of our athletes are good at knowing what they can handle on race day. And since cross country changes so much course to course, we don't try to put a lot of emphasis on like, this is the pace we feel like we should go out in. We tend to be a little bit more with like, all right, I think Elias is a top 5 guy in this race. So we want to go out with, the top 10, keeping the top 5 in sight, and then work our way through the field as we go. And I think with cross country, we race often enough that like we understand how to race well. Most of our workouts, as far as training goes, we just want to get more fit. And so I would say like I've seen some programs that will do, they might do like a Michigan workout, or they might do, 8 by 1K with a 60-second rest, which is probably less recovery than we would typically do. And I think all of those are, they're fine workouts, and some of them will use it as a predictor to say, okay, I know if my athletes can handle, 2K reps or 3 by 2 or 3 by 3K or something like that, then I know they can handle that for an 8,000 meter distance. But the best predictor of what they're going to do in an 8K is let them run an 8K. So I try not to get too hung up on that, because it also then turns into like, what happens if the workout that was meant to be a predictor goes badly? And now they think like, oh God, I'm supposed to be running a 27-minute 8K when Chris has been telling me I'm a mid 25-minute guy all season. Like, I think most of our kids show up on race day well enough that we don't have to worry too much about a predictor workout. We might see that more in track though. It's just a little bit easier to control the variables, and in a season where it's all run on a 400-meter oval.
I love that. I love how you're trusting your athletes and coaching them to use their instincts and maybe focus more on their positioning and yeah, and I guess that's the nature of cross country. So that makes sense. So Chris, I would like to put a bow around all of this and ask you 10 rapid fire questions.
Okay, let's do it.
With the understanding that these are questions or variations thereof that get asked at the end of every episode, and I think it's fun to see how each coach puts their own little unique spin on it. So let's start with the first one. What's your favorite threshold? Or I think you've termed, instead of threshold, you talk about tempo. So favorite threshold or tempo workout?
For men, we typically really like doing 3x2 miles. For our women, it's usually either 2x2 miles, or if it's someone that's like really advanced and doing 5 miles worth of work, it'll be like a 2-2-1 tempo. So, we're typically doing that with like about 2 minutes of rest in between each rep.
And number two, what math or method do you use to come up with a runner's tempo pace?
So we use 3 different tempo paces. We kind of give them an easy tempo, a medium, and a hard one. So we will start whatever number I think they can run based on just different races. That's the number that we consider their like medium tempo. We will always start them off with the easier one because we want to know, like, without a doubt, they're going to run this workout. They're going to be able to finish it. They're going to be able to handle it. So we're trying to undercoach them a lot early in the season, knowing that they're probably going to move through that first pace within like 2 weeks, move into the stuff where they should be, and then take that next step of where should they actually be later in the season when they've gotten fitter. Those are usually about 10 seconds apart per mile.
Number three, how do you structure rest and recovery within the season?
So post-season, usually we'll take off time after the outdoor season and after cross. I have found that when we take time completely off, kids get injured when they come back, no matter how easy we bring them back. So usually for about 2 weeks after the season ends, we'll try and run every third day, just so their body remembers that they are a runner. And it might just be like a 20-minute shakeout. So it usually gives us about 21 days max where we're giving them every third day. So anywhere in that like 2 to 3 week period of, hey, just get a run in every like 3 or 4 days, you'll be fine.
And within the season, this is still part of that question, between hard sessions, do you have any rules of thumb there?
It just depends on the athlete. Some of them, like our 800 group, anyone who runs like the 15 and would drop down, they're probably running 3 workouts a week. Most of our people that are running 1500 but would sooner move up to a 5K than drop down to an 8, they're usually taking at least 2 days in between hard sessions.
And number four, apart from running itself, what is the next most important element of training in your opinion?
Sleep is probably the biggest one, but I would say if we're sticking to like things that we're prescribing, we like being in the weight room. I think it's hard to keep people healthy and to like, again, raise the ceiling enough if you aren't at least a little bit strong. Maybe a third nod to, I really like kids that aqua jog or swim. So it's a good way of getting a little bit extra in.
Number five, what's a mental strategy that you coach others to draw upon in training or in the race itself?
So one that I like is walking through the race enough times so that like, everything that could go wrong and how you would like to react going into it. The other is that whenever we have someone that like has a confidence issue, I try to teach them how to be sarcastic and basically be sarcastically arrogant to themselves, to just think like, even if you know that you're going to be somewhere in the 200th place in a big cross country race, like, I think someone should kind of learn how to just walk in and be like, oh, like, how do you think you're going to do today? Like, oh, I'll probably just try and win it. You might as well, even if they're, nowhere near the top. I think just them pretending to be good is sometimes a good way to just trick them into being like, all right, like the race isn't that scary. I'll be confident whether I should be or shouldn't be.
Number 6, assuming that someone's training is already well balanced and they're ready for a jump in mileage, would you rather add 15 to 20 minutes to all their easy runs, or would you rather run an extra 1 to 2 reps during their hard interval sessions?
If we're trying to raise total volume, I'd probably rather make their regular runs harder, just so we're not adding extra intensity and volume in the same go. So I'd probably lean towards doing it to the easy stuff first, and then maybe later on letting it carry over into some of the quality sessions.
And just to build on that, do you have a cap where you say, look, past this point, it's no longer an easy run from a volume standpoint?
Not really. I mean, we'll have like a long run, but even then, like, I think the difficulty of the day is determined by how many miles you give them. So my kids kind of know that, like, I don't tell them what pace to run. They know that the goal is that they want to get something out of that run. Sometimes that means that they are going to try and add some fitness by having a solid 8 to 10 mile day. Sometimes they know that just, I had a really hard workout and I probably have another one coming up pretty soon. The goal of today is I need to just recover. I need to survive. So I would sooner drop mileage than raise it for anyone. And just, for us, it's just, we want to get through it. We want to make sure we're doing enough that we're getting better, but not enough that we're worried about, mileage should never be the thing that's making or breaking our season.
Got it. Okay. So number 7, what's something that you've read about within the world of research or exercise physiology that you find interesting and like digging into?
So there's a study that Scott Christensen told me about once, and I need to find it. I should probably just email him, but basically it was the idea that the most recent stimulus that you had before going to sleep ends up being the thing that you respond most strongly to. So if you have someone that does 2 sessions in a day, one of them being, let's say, a lactate threshold session, and the other one being like a speed development session, I know those don't play that nicely with each other throughout the day, but he brought up to me once the study that showed that whatever one you did most recently, so like the evening session, is going to be what your body essentially tries to adapt to the most. So if you make it your speed development session, it's going to tend to, kind of neurally code that one a little bit more. Or if it's your lactate threshold session, it just kind of looks at that and says, that's the most recent stimulus that, like, we're trying to figure out how to survive the next time. Now that we're sleeping, that's how we're going to try and we're like kind of orient our recovery towards. So I'd be interested to see more of that, or even if that's a study that he can dig up and show me. But I think that'd be a neat way to look at things, where, especially now you hear teams doing like double threshold sessions, or like the debate between should you run a double in the morning before your quality session or later. Like, it might be a good way of unlocking a little extra fitness just by changing the order of how you do something and not necessarily changing the training itself.
Yeah, that's where my mind went too, for all the people who are doing those doubles. Should you do your hard session in the morning or wait until the evening? Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. I wasn't aware of that study. So number 8, your favorite book or resource on training, coaching, or running in general?
Run with the Best by Irv Ray and Tony Benson. I think it's out of production, but if you can find it, it's the best combination of, like, it'll give you all the scientific stuff that you need in the beginning, but it very quickly goes into, this is how you apply it. These are some workouts that work for it. These are progressions of those workouts, and give a lot of examples of how that fits within training plans throughout different times of the year. I think it does a really good job, and I think it feels less theory than a lot of other books that sometimes rely a little too much on that and don't go into the, hey, like, at the end of the day, like, your kids have to run this. So
that's a good one. I haven't heard that one in a long time. So number 9, we happen to be recording this during the 2022 World Championships in Eugene. Who is your favorite runner, race, or moment in athletics history?
So I grew up watching a lot of like older Sebastian Coe races. I don't know why. I think it was that like I read his training book that his dad wrote. So like I always really liked following, obviously not following, so he was way before my time, but like I always really liked watching those races, especially between him, Ovett, and just like the dynasty of middle distance running back then. Um, so he was definitely up there. But the steeplechase is by far my favorite race to coach. It's my favorite event to watch. It was really cool seeing Americans do really well in the event recently. So we'll see. I think the women's steeple final is in a couple of days. I don't remember if that's what day that is going on, but steeple is my favorite one to follow and watch.
Yes, and they just had the men's steeple too, with El Bakali of Morocco taking the win in a
Yep.
final sprint finish.
That was a good example of like our steeplechaser this year. She probably had the slowest 5K PR in the entire field for regionals, but like she was one of the best in our region. She's just good at technique. And that race was a big one where like you saw the winner was the guy who won technique over the last water jump. And like there's so much momentum lost in that race because of that. So if you're a high school kid and you want to be good in college, if you want to own the steeplechase, you can do really well.
All right, and number 10, do you see yourself entering races 20 years from now? And if not, what can fill that void in your life that you used to fill by training hard and enjoying the fruits of your labor on race day?
I would be very surprised if I'm racing by that point. I always grew up afraid of seeing the clock wind backwards and seeing myself get slower and slower every year. I've only come to grips with that very recently, but I like watching my kids race. I am way more excited to see them do it than I ever was to see me do it. Like I liked racing. I liked being competitive. I enjoyed like stepping up to some athletes that were clearly better than me and still just throwing everything you have at them, knowing that you're probably not going to beat them, but just being that person that just hangs on long enough for them to be like, how is this guy still here? Like that always gave me a lot of pleasure. I think for me though, like I'm way happier watching my kids race, and I'm okay with that being how I compete these days, is seeing what ways I can make my team better and, let myself live vicariously through them if that's how I want to look at it.
Well done. Chris, this has been a great conversation today. Where can people go to follow, support, or get in touch with you and the things that you care about, such as LIU athletics?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find on most social media stuff. I think everything's either listed under Chris Sauer LIU, or I think Chris Sauer.runs maybe on Instagram, but Twitter is probably where I do most of that stuff, with just trying to post things about training or, how to sort of get better with things. And our team, obviously Long Island University, it's been a good little time here so far, and I think we've done a lot in a few years, and excited to see what else we can do.
Thank you, Coach. So for Chris Sauer, I'm Jonathan Mederos, reminding everyone to be thankful that you can run, and for all the ways that running makes us better at life. Till next time.
Thanks for having me.